Well, hello and welcome to Ask An Apologist. My name is Matthew Mittelberg. I'm the Director of Content at Apologetics, Inc., and I'm joined by Alycia Wood, my colleague and a speaker for Apologetics, Inc. How you doing, Alycia?
Hey, doing great.
Awesome. So we do one of these every month, and the goal of this is to be a place where you can ask an apologist your questions about faith, about evidence for faith, about the difficult objections that people bring against faith. And what we try to do is we try to theme it based on a holiday or the season that we're in. And of course, yesterday was Easter. So naturally, today's theme is all about Easter, the resurrection, Jesus, and the case for why we believe what we do as Christians as sort of this central historical claim about the resurrection. So that's what tonight's topic is on. And wherever you're watching this from, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, we've got several different streams going out from this. You can put a comment in there to let us know where you're watching from or to ask your question, ask your comments. And we love hearing from you guys to your questions. And don't feel like you're going to stump us. You might stump us, but we're going to do our best to try to answer your questions as best as we can. And because we believe that Christianity, it can stand up to the difficult objections that people have. We believe that it can stand up to the questions that people have about it. And we believe the resurrection is really true, that Jesus really rose from the dead. Alycia, do you want to add anything on to that or anything about what it is that we do here at Apologetics, Inc.?
Yeah, sure. I think the idea of asking questions and trying to understand more about what we believe is not only healthy, but I think it's what we should do, whether you're a Christian, whether you're not a Christian, whether you're trying to figure it out. And so I think we here at Apologetics Inc. just love being a part of helping to facilitate that, whether it's through the articles on the website, where we've got, Matthew's written an article on the resurrection. So on this very topic, like that's on our website, apologetics.org. We have some other articles on the resurrection through Derek Caldwell, whether it's through our speaking events, or even when it's just we get the opportunity to sit here and actually ask or answer questions that people have. And I think whether you are a Christian or a non-Christian that's on this, definitely feel free to take advantage of whatever question might be in your mind, and if we can answer it, we will. And if not, we most likely have a place that we can send you to that will give you an answer. So I think it's good for us to know why we believe whatever we believe. And so that's what we try to do here at Apologetics Inc.
That's great. And shouting out the website is really good too, apologetics.org, because we have been posting a lot of articles relating to the resurrection. I wrote one on specifically the question of, is Easter irrational? Is it irrational to believe that miracles are possible? And we can talk about that a little bit. But we've also been doing a series of articles written by a guy named Derek Caldwell, who's a friend of both of ours, who has written an excellent series just addressing the claims of the resurrection, some of the evidence behind it, some of the objections that skeptics have brought up against the case for the resurrection. So it's an 8-part series, and I believe today we posted number 5. So last week I was just scheduling those to go out all this week, and it's been really cool to hear some of the feedback from people who are reading those. So
absolutely. And I'd really encourage people to read them, because he'll hit on a lot of things that maybe you don't hear talked about a lot. And I like that he takes on some different angles, even some of the stuff. It's like, I hadn't thought about it like that. So I encourage people to read it and get a little twist on things.
Yeah. See Anna checking in from the UK. Thanks
Hi,
for
Anna.
that. Good to hear
Good to
from
see
you,
you,
Anna.
Anna.
And yeah, hope you're staying warm out there in the UK. So I'm down in Florida here, and it's nice and sunny out here. But anyway,
Why
I don't
would
know
you
why I
rub
say
that
that.
into Anna's face,
Yeah,
Matthew?
sorry, Anna. Just happy that I'm here and anyway. Great. So let me start. Let me just begin today's discussion by diving into a little bit of the case for the resurrection, because this is sort of the topic of tonight's discussion. And if you've never heard this before, you might just think, okay, what is it that we're really talking about here? If you're a Christian and you're listening to this, you might just think, well, the Bible says it, and therefore I believe it. And if you're not a Christian and you're listening to this, you might go, hey, why should I even take this seriously at all? It's just something that Christians believe. But what a lot of people don't know is that the resurrection itself is something that a lot of historical data points to. And actually, we can look at historical data that is agreed to by the vast majority of historians, whether they're Christian, non Christian, secular, or not. They agree to a certain number of facts about the historical Jesus. And then, based on those facts, which we call the minimal facts, we can then argue for the conclusion that Jesus actually rose from the dead. So, for example, I like to talk about the fact that Jesus was dead on the cross. His body was gone from the tomb. He was then seen by the apostles. And then this was all reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. So dead, gone, seen, and reported. And so just going briefly through those, he was really dead on the cross. And first, just before all of that, to say he really existed. And historians are not in doubt about this, despite in the UK, started dog on the UK again, but there was a survey, I think it was 33% of young people think that Jesus never existed in the UK. I mean, it's unbelievably a statistic that I heard on that. But that is completely not a real view in scholarship. John Dixon, who's a historian, has had an open challenge for about a decade now, where he said, if you can tell me one full professor of history or the classics at any accredited university in the world that denies Jesus's existence, I will eat a page of my Bible. And he's had that open challenge, and he's had it year after year. He's repeated it many times. No one's able to bring him not one single example of a full professor at an accredited university in history or the classics that believes that. So that is telling when it comes to the existence of Jesus. Even Bart Ehrman, who's one of the toughest critics of Christianity, says this is not a real question. Not a real question. I'm sorry, Anna. I don't mean to attack you. I actually love the UK, so it's a little bit out of character for me to even talk about it at all in any sort of negative way. I love Oxford. I got to spend some time there, and it's one of the most amazing places in the world. So,
way to not let him get away with that, Anna. Well done.
Thank you for that. So, but yeah, looking at these four facts, Jesus was dead on the cross. He was really dead. And when you look at the actual medical investigation into what really happened, what really occurred on the cross, the Romans were experts at killing. They knew what they were doing, and the Roman centurions would actually face the death penalty if they allowed a victim to escape. So they made sure that Jesus was dead, which is what we have in all of the accounts. Then he was gone from the tomb. And this is one of the facts that there's a little bit of debate on, because some skeptical scholars will say, oh, he wasn't even buried at all, or, he was just thrown into a mass grave. But there are really good reasons to believe that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the Jewish council, who was mentioned in the Gospels. You wouldn't pick him as the kind of guy to bury Jesus, and yet they mention it as him, which lends credibility to that fact. And then this was all in the city where Jesus was crucified. So if he was still in a tomb, they could go to that tomb and have the evidence that they would need that he didn't rise from the dead. So then you have that the disciples had seen him alive. And this is one of the most surprising facts. I was shocked when I first found this out. The fact that there's agreement that the disciples had experiences which they interpreted as Jesus rising from the dead and appearing to them physically. Now, some skeptics will say, no, this was not a physical, a literal resurrection. This was some sort of vision or hallucination. And so it wasn't what they would call a veridical appearance. And so they try to discount it that way. But the problem is you've got all of these groups of people seeing Jesus. You've got the group of over 500 people mentioned in 1 Corinthians 15. You've got several descriptions of the disciples seeing Jesus together at the same time in groups. And hallucinations can't be shared. Lee Strobel likes to say, you can't say to someone, how'd you like that dream I had last night? Right. That's not something you can really, you can say it, but it's not going to make any sense, because dreams are individual occurrences in our minds. And then all of this was reported within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. And this is one of the more recent facts that we've sort of established. The fact that the gospel accounts were not later, fictional accounts that were created by late Christians. No, actually, they were created by eyewitnesses who had to be in that time, at that place. The level of biographical information, the level of geographical knowledge, naming structures, all sorts of things tell us that the people that wrote the Gospels were eyewitnesses who were there at that time in that place. And so all of this says, how do we account for all of this data? And the only explanation that accounts for all of it is that Jesus actually rose from the dead. And it's actually one that accounts for all of the data very well. It actually explains all of the data in a very natural way. So that's sort of one way of looking at the case for the resurrection of Jesus. And yeah, I would love for anybody who has questions about that, maybe doubts, maybe you've got objections, maybe you've got alternative theories, please put those in the comments, because we would love to address those. Alycia, do you have anything to say about that case and
Yeah,
anything on that?
absolutely. So I think, first of all, those are really well laid out facts. One of the interesting things about the resurrection that's a bit unique from some of the other things we do, for example, when we talk about suffering, or when we talk about, maybe why is God hidden, we come at it from a slightly different approach. But with the resurrection, you have a very evidential case, right? This isn't like, what do you feel is true? This isn't like, well, let me explain something. It's like, we have a good set of criteria that when you look at it, okay, if you want to say he didn't rise, okay, that's fine. But what other explanation do you have that fits all of these things? Like, we don't have anybody who says, like, oh, Jesus' body's in my tomb or something like that, right? So you don't have any of those alternative explanations. And so the reason why I think this is so important is because so often I think, people will say, I don't get it as much anymore, but I think I got it a little bit more earlier on, when I was first in apologetics. People would say things like, is there any way that, like, there's no way you wouldn't believe, like, Christians just believe, and there's no way that they would not, follow this because what their parents said or something. And
Mhm.
I think the resurrection, changes that, because I think this is our massive, what's called falsifiability factor, that this is the way that Christianity can be proven false, is if we dig up Jesus' body somewhere, we can demonstrate and prove that it's Jesus' body. But if we're able to dig up his body, then the whole thing is done. And not because Alycia says it or because Matthew says it, but because the Bible actually says it in 1 Corinthians 15. And so I
Mhm.
think this is a really important thing for people to realize, whether you're a Christian or not, that, the reason why there was such a big fanfare over the weekend isn't just because people are looking for a way to have a family gathering, or looking for a way to wear nice clothes, or anything like, pass around eggs and things like that. No, it's actually because for the Christian, this is what their faith hinges on, and what they're and so I think that falsifiability factor is important for us to recognize the importance of the resurrection, in terms of its credibility.
And I think that's really important to note, because I've heard secular, or not secular, but more uh, progressive Christians try to claim we shouldn't argue for the literal physical resurrection of Jesus, because that puts us in danger, right? It puts us in danger if we do find the body someday, or we do do this. Then we should just claim that it was maybe just a spiritual resurrection, because that's safer. But what I want to say is, no, that's number one. That's just not what the claim is. That's just not what Christianity is. Oops, thumbs up there. That's not what Christianity is. Is this kind of claim of a spiritual resurrection? It's always been this claim that Jesus literally physically rose from the dead. And Paul
Right.
makes that very clear in 1 Corinthians 15. He says, if Christ has not been raised, then you are dead in your trespasses,
Yeah.
and we are of all men are most to be pitied. So he makes this very clear. But also, it actually gives me confidence to know that I'm making a real claim about history. This is not just a feeling. It's not just like I have this strong
Mm.
spiritual sense that this is the true religion. It's no, I really believe that there was a man named Jesus who walked and talked on the earth 2,000 years ago, who died, and then he literally physically rose from the dead. And so it gives a sort of a concreteness to my faith
Mhm.
to say, actually, because I believe in that, I also can believe that I will someday be resurrected. I don't just have a metaphorical savior. I have a real savior that can really save me in that kind of sense. So I think it's
Yeah.
important for that.
Yeah, and there's another passage in the letter of Hebrews that talks about how Jesus's death um, basically it helps give him control over the power of death, but it
Mm,
also helps free us from the fear of death.
mm,
And so this resurrection has the direct implications for us. Many people are scared to die. They wonder what's next or what's going on or all these kind of things. But his resurrection actually even frees us from that fear. So there is even more personal aspect to us outside of, paying the penalty for our sins, outside of taking on our shame. It's also a sense of freeing people from the fear because of what he's done. And I
yeah.
think that's also something that's worth noting as well.
Yeah, the fear of death is huge, and I think, yeah, again, if we're going to believe that Jesus can actually save us, that he can
Mhm.
actually raise us from the dead, then he has to be an actual savior, not just a metaphorical savior or a
Exactly.
spiritual savior. He's got to be a
Hmm.
real savior. So
Exactly.
that's why Christians have always insisted that Jesus has risen from the dead.
Yep.
So we've got some good questions coming in here. I'm going to
Okay.
start with this second one here. We'll come
Okay.
back to the one before that. Um, Jamie says, "Hi guys, thanks for the Q&A. I have a question. Do you know of any list of extra biblical sources that reaffirms this claim?" And that's a great question because we want to see, is there any sources outside of the Bible. Now I do want to point out, though, I do think that the Bible itself is an accurate historical document, and
Right.
it's a reliable source for us as we think about the resurrection itself, as we think about the claims that it makes. And it's not just one source, it's multiple sources, because we have multiple gospels all reporting on the same fact. So with that said, there are other ancient historical sources that talk about it. And so we have in Mike Lacona's book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach, he goes through and he evaluates each of the different sources. I have a list of them here. So he's got Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Mara Sepian, Thallus, Lucian, Celsus, rabbinic sources, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, the letter of Barnabas, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Judas, Epistle of the Apostles, and he just goes on, and he evaluates them. And some of them he says, look, this is so late in the record
Mhm.
that it's not really a valuable historical source. But some of them he says, no, these are very early, and they're reporting on what Christians believe at that time, at that place, and they lend credibility to this idea that this is what Christians have believed from the very beginning, that Jesus died and that he rose again. So if
Yeah.
you're curious about that list, I would definitely check out Mike Lacona's book on that.
Yeah, and just to give you, just kind of this is a great question, Jamie, and I think one of the things to keep in mind is when we're looking for extra biblical sources, oftentimes those sources are gonna believe that Jesus rose from the dead, they're gonna be Christians who say that Jesus rose from the dead, and so then it can make it tricky to say, "Well, it's extra biblical, okay, but it's still a Christian source." A lot of times people don't want to accept that as a credible source. So I think it's important for us to understand from secular sources, so non-Christian sources, here how much can we know? Okay. So Matthew just rolled off a whole list of people, and he's right that there's some of those that are going to be a bit more solid, maybe than others for sure. Some of that are going to be a bit more questionable, but there's several that are not questionable, such as a passage by Josephus and Tacitus, who Matthew mentioned. Tacitus is a great Roman historian. Josephus was a great Jewish historian. So neither one of them are Christians. And if you were to read them, you're gonna learn a lot of things. You're gonna learn Jesus lived. You're gonna learn that he was crucified. You're gonna learn that it was Pontius Pilate who was the one who crucified him, which is a very interesting detail that they both note. Um, and and that he has followers. I think Tacitus mentions that these followers are named Christians after Christus, who's the name of their follower. Like he mentions this. So at the very least, what we know is that Jesus lived, died, was crucified by Pontius Pilate, had followers. His followers are still around to this day, but there's nobody saying, that his body is here or go visit this tomb. There's nobody saying, hey, his body was stolen somewhere. It just there's actually no mention of it. And so, but he has followers. And so something is really interesting that I think we can and going back to some of Matthew's minimal facts approach that he outlined really well, is you got to remember his disciples saw him walk on water, raise people from the dead, heal people, heal the blind, heal the sick, leper. Like they just saw him do so much. But it wasn't until they saw him resurrect from the dead that they were fully convinced that
Mm.
that was what changed them radically. And that's why that minimal facts approach can be really helpful, because it helps emphasize the impact of the resurrection on the people who are eyewitnesses to him, both before and after. And they trusted in, because one of the minimal facts talks about his brother James. His brother
Yeah.
James was not a person who affirmed Jesus's message while he was alive. He's like, dude, like, I'm your brother. Like, what are you talking about? Like, no, you're not anybody special. Like, and so he didn't get it. But afterwards, everything changed for him. And he's the one who wrote the book of James, I believe. I think it was the brother
Yeah.
James. Maybe I'm wrong. Okay.
Yes.
So,
Yep.
okay. So all that to say, what you see is a massive shift post his death. So once again, if he was in a tomb, they wouldn't be talking about it like that. They wouldn't be willing to die for that. He's in a tomb. He's dead. What's the point? He was another person who claimed to be the Messiah and died, and he's gone. Why did they keep this message going? What did it benefit them? But it cost them their life, unless it was like something is different about him. Jesus wasn't the first person to claim to be, the Messiah that was going to come and Israel thought he was going to free them in terms of creating an external nation for them, but he was actually looking to free us from our internal slavery and bondage to our own sin and our own wrongs that we've done. But there's other people that claim to be the Messiah. So he wasn't unique in that. But what was unique about him is that he didn't stay dead. And that is what revolutionized. And once again, there is no other good explanation that's been put forward. So I think that that's really worth noting.
Well, I love that you bring up James, because, I mentioned those 4 facts that I usually talk about when it comes to the resurrection, but those are not the only 4 facts about the historical Jesus of which there is consensus. There's the fact that James, the brother of Jesus, who was a skeptic, later became a follower and a leader in the early church, and then was later martyred for his faith. You have Paul, the enemy of Jesus, the one who is persecuting the early church, who then later has this experience with Jesus and becomes the most prolific evangelist of all time. And then later is martyred for his faith. So you've got more and more facts about the historical Jesus that lend credibility to this. And also the fact that he was viewed by the people of his time as a miracle worker. This is another one that I was surprised the first time I heard this. That even skeptical scholars will admit, not that Jesus did miracles, because they're skeptics. That's what that's what they believe. But that he was viewed by the people around him as a miracle worker. Even the enemies of Jesus acknowledge that he is doing these things at that time, but they try to catch him on a technicality. So they try to say, yeah, you healed this guy, but you did it on the Sabbath, and therefore, you can't be from God. So they don't say, no, he didn't heal that guy. No, he, this is a trick, some sort of conjuring trick or something. No, they go, okay, yeah, you did it, but it was by the power of Satan, because, you did it on the Sabbath. So,
Right.
that's, which is laughable to us, I think, at this point, looking back, but it
Yeah.
lends
And
credibility to this idea that Jesus was a miracle worker.
yes. And I can't remember, sorry to interrupt you. I cannot remember which source it was, but it's one of the Jewish sources. I don't know if it's the Babylonian Talmud, but it talks about how Jesus did these kind of healings or miracles using sorcery, right? So that is an acknowledgement of the fact that he actually did something different. Now they attributed it to sorcery, and obviously, his disciples attributed it to something else. But and there was also a story of his birth. And it may be the Babylonian Talmud. I'm sorry, I'm not remembering exactly where, but they're both Jewish sources. But it's talking about that Jesus' mother was Mary, but her father was a Roman soldier. Now, it's interesting that they would say this, because once again, they're trying to find alternate explanations of the story that's being given, right? So you see that people are trying to counter, because these stories are being said. Like, why didn't they say, hey, his mother was this other woman, and or he had, talked about how many brothers and sisters he had, because that wasn't relevant. They attacked Mary and his father because that was essential to his identity and to his divinity, and that was what was being taught. So you have these other sources that, even in their challenging, are therefore affirming some of the things that were important and that were being said, or that he
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Well, even in the Gospels, the Pharisees, say, we are not illegitimate children, kind of emphasizing the fact that they think that he is,
Exactly.
because of this claim to virgin birth. So,
Hmm.
even within the biblical record, you see some of that. So,
Yeah.
glad you like that, Jamie. There's more where that came from. Anna, what was unique about him? He didn't stay dead. Agree,
Exactly.
agree, agree. Although
Yeah.
that's what we're arguing for right now.
Exactly.
Um,
And can I just say one quick thing on that?
yeah,
Is that, yeah, the fact that he didn't stay dead, therefore gives credibility to everything else he said when he was alive, right? And that's the
yes,
that's the key thing. It isn't just that he rose from the dead, but if he indeed did rise, then it actually gives credibility to the things that he says that were true about him that maybe were hard to believe during his life. And that's what also makes it such a big deal. Is now we can therefore go back, and it gives credibility to not just the gospels and what the letters in the New Testament, but it gives back credibility to the Old Testament, and all the things that were talked about him coming and what the Messiah was going to be like, and even him being crucified over Passover, and even him being a lamb. All of these Old Testament concepts that he fulfilled as well. And so it helps put together the whole picture for us. So if he did rise, then it gives him credibility as a Messiah.
that's that's really important to point out, Alicia, because I've heard some people say, like, look, why does him raising from the dead necessarily mean that he's God all of a sudden? Why does it necessarily mean that we should worship him or something like that? Like maybe there was this sort of miraculous event, but why does that kind of connect to this idea? And it's because of the context with which he claimed that. He claimed to be the Jewish Messiah that was prophesied. He claimed to be the Lord of the Sabbath. He claimed to be the judge of the world. He claimed to have divine titles and divine authority. In short, he claimed to be God, which is why they crucified him. Right. So that's, they weren't crucifying him because they didn't like him, or they didn't like his style. No, they crucified him because he claimed to be God. He said, before Abraham was, I am. And when he's before the judges in Mark, he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man come on the clouds of heaven. And they say, what blasphemy? What else do we need to hear? This mere man claims to be God. So he's claiming this thing, and then he predicts the fact that he will die and then rise from the dead, and then it happens, and that validates his claim. And that's part of why I love talking about this subject. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about, because it's sort of a silver bullet either way. Like, if you can prove that the resurrection didn't happen, well, then Jesus is not, he's not a prophet, because prophets prophesy true things. He's not God, obviously. He's not even a good teacher, because good teachers teach true things. He's just a man who had some, delusions of grandeur. But if he did rise from the dead, well, then it validates his claims. It shows that he has the authority over life and death, that he will judge the living and the dead, and that we ought to worship and follow him. So the stakes literally couldn't be higher here when talking about the
Exactly.
resurrection.
No,
So,
absolutely. I think all of that was very well said. I think that's why it's more than just this is what the evidence says, but has great meaning for everything else. Yeah.
yeah. Speaking of great meaning, Anna, thank you for sharing this about your brother, and knowing where your brother is truly helps. And I just want to say on that for those of you who are
Mm.
more skeptical in the audience, just to say that I think you should want this to be true. I think sometimes the idea of the comforting nature of faith gets a bad rap, because we psychologize faith, and we try to say with Freud that people just want a father in the sky, and so they create these things. Um, but that's not necessarily true. It could be that we want these things because they're what we were designed for. We want a father, we want a heavenly father because he's designed us to want him. And actually, the knowledge and the confidence that we know where we're going to go when we die, and that because Jesus was raised from the dead, we will be raised from the dead. Uh, that really does help. It helps you to live a life that is more confident, that is more free of anxiety, and not to say, hey, this helps me, so therefore I should believe it. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying I think you should want it to be true. And I think we sometimes forget that in discussions around this. So thank you for sharing that, Anna.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. I think you hit on another meaning or significance behind this, because it means that when somebody dies that we love and care about, it isn't the end of a story. It is, in a sense, a beginning of a story for someone who is a Christian, who has accepted Christ, because of the fact that it's like the best is now to begin.
Mm,
And that does change the way in which we experience death. I mean, death is always a loss for us, right? We always are losing in death. We always lose a person in death. And so it's always a loss. But what's interesting is that for that individual who has accepted Jesus, it is such a great gain for them. And so it's interesting, the same experience can have two different experiences, I guess you could say, when it comes to the outcome. And so you're right. I think because of Jesus' death, like I was saying, like it says in Hebrews 2, this idea that he controls the power of death, like we've talked about, he's taken that out of the hands of the devil. And also, he also, removes that fear of death. And the idea is that the Bible also talks about that we have a hope. And hope is really, really, really important. Um, we know that without hope, people can fall into great despair, just in general, in life in general. They can fall into great despair. Proverbs says, "A hope deferred makes the heart sick." This, and so without hope, we really do live life differently, outside of any kind of belief, religion, whatever it might be. And and so I think the idea that we have hope because of the resurrection is huge. It's huge not just for when we lose somebody, but it's huge in our day-to-day life. When things are tough, when work is tough, when life is tough, when adulting is tough, which it is. I remember all the times I used to whine when I was a kid about, this or that thing. And you're like, oh man, things are so easy then. But like when adulting is tough, you always know that there is a hope of a guarantee of something that is to come. And it's
mm,
almost like watching a movie when you already know the end. And when you know
mm,
the end of a movie, you watch the whole other part of the movie differently, because where, "Oh, I see that, but I don't need to be worried because it's going to turn out well in the end." Or, "Oh, I see this happening, but I know how it's going to resolve." And it changes your experience. And so, yeah, the resurrection does give us a great hope, which in turn influences and changes how we live this life. And so I think Matthew said was a great point. This is something that you would want to be true. Like you should want this to be true. And and
mm,
and and don't, once again, like you're saying, you don't want it to be true because it's some kind of wish fulfillment. I don't want that. But that's why we lay out the evidence for the resurrection so much, because what you wish is true actually is. And that's important. You don't just wish for something and then live your life as if it's true, but is what I want to be true actually true? And I think that's where the evidence helps us know that what we want is really there and that we can all have that hope.
mm. My favorite article on the article series that we're posting from Derek Caldwell is coming up on April 3rd, so 2 days from now. So tune in for that, because he talks exactly about this, just the way that the resurrection changes everything. It changes the way that we think about life. It changes the way that we think about death. And so be sure to keep an eye out for that on our socials as well as on our website. We got a question back here a little while back, so we're gonna
Okay.
get to that. But let me just remind everybody, this is the Ask an Apologist live stream, and so we are here to try our best to answer your questions, your spiritual questions. And today's theme is all about the resurrection and about Easter. And so if you have questions about Easter and the resurrection and what Christians believe and why they believe it, and maybe you have some objections, maybe you have some difficult objections that you want to bring up, we're going to do our best to address those. And so this next one that we've got says, I've heard some biblical critics have said that the 1 Corinthians 15 creed has some interpolative aspects to it. Simply put, what about the theory that the early Christian creed was added later? So let me give a little bit of background around this. So often when we're talking about the belief in the resurrection, one of the earliest sources that we have is the creed in 1 Corinthians 15, where Paul says, I delivered to you what I received, that Christ was buried, that he was seen by, that he was risen, that he was seen by the apostles, by the 500, here to James, and then last of all to me. So, and that's a paraphrase of what he says, but that's the creed. And what's interesting about this is that it's not just a passage of scripture. So First Corinthians 15 is a letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthian church in around AD 53. But he's stating a formal statement of beliefs of the early church that already had to be creedalized at that time. And he's explicitly stating this. He's using language to indicate that he is handing on a creed that was handed on to him. And so scholars think about, when did he receive this creed? When was he in Jerusalem to receive this creed? And some scholars will say it was 3 years after the crucifixion that he received this creed. Some people say maybe a couple years after that, but whatever it was very early that he received it. And then it already had to be in creedal form before that for him to receive this. So this was a formal statement of the early church of what they believed about Jesus and his resurrection. And that's a very valuable source for us as we're investigating, as we're thinking about what's the evidence that the early church believed that Jesus rose from the dead. So this is a valuable resource for us. Now, the question of whether or not it's been had Christian elements interpolated into it, I've not heard that before, and I wonder if maybe you're confusing that for other ancient historical sources. So, for example, in Josephus, we have several different passages that talk about Jesus, and there's one passage where he says something that sounds way too Christian. So he's like, he was the Messiah or something like that. And a lot of scholars will say that was interpolated, that was added in later by Christians who wanted to beef up what Josephus was saying. But I've not heard that about the 1 Corinthians 15 creed, and I don't think that we can say that with any confidence. I don't know how you would get to that point, because I don't know what would be left over if we take out all the Christian elements of the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. I mean, literally every element is something that Christians believe. And so I don't know what we would really be left with at that point. And I don't think we have the kind of textual variants that would lead to any kind of conclusion that there was sort of a later addition to the 1 Corinthians 15 creed. So I think we can be confident that this creed is what was handed to Paul, and that he was delivering to the early church. And that, again, this is even, let's say, for example, that we didn't have the understanding that this was a creed, but this is just something that Paul is writing in AD 53 or around that point. That's well within the lifetime of the eyewitnesses. There are people that Paul literally says in that passage, he's like, some of whom are fallen asleep, dead, and yet some are still with us. So he's literally saying, if you don't believe what I'm saying, go ask them, right? They're still around. They're still here. You can go in and interview them and see if what they're saying still stands up. So I think it's a very valuable resource for us as we think about the historical evidence for the resurrection.
No, I think that's great. And I think, just to add on some thought to this, 1 Corinthians 15 is a very important passage. But what's also great is that we have other really important passages as well. And because this is so early on, as Matthew alluded to, yes, you can check with the eyewitnesses. And so when you look at, like, Luke, for example, okay, Luke didn't meet Jesus. He literally was conducting an investigation for Theophilus, talking to the eyewitnesses to see what it was that they experienced and what they saw and what they heard. And so Luke writes about Jesus' life, his death, and his resurrection. So we have from Luke that the resurrection happened. You can read John, and not just the Gospel of John, but even First John, the book of First John, where it talks about, he basically says, these are things that we've heard, that we've seen with our eyes, that our hands have touched. Like, this is what we're saying to you. And so what he's just constantly relaying eyewitness accounts. So there are plenty of people that were still around that could fact check Paul or anybody else who's coming up with something that didn't happen, because, as Matthew said, they were there, right? There's many people who did see the life of Jesus. It wasn't lived in secret. It was a very public life, actually. And so I think that is really what can help us know, because 1 Corinthians 15 is in sync with a lot of the other things that we see and read.
That's great. Susan has a question here. Think of the Matthew 12:52 through 54 passage about the dead rising out of the graves. Wander around the city. Did they go back to the grave immediately? Did they rise to heaven immediately? And this is a very interesting passage that's only found in Matthew as it relates to the resurrection. This idea that the saints also, there were also these saints that broke out of their tombs and also rose from the dead when Jesus was crucified. And to be honest, I don't know the answer to this question. This is one of those questions that I want to ask Jesus someday in person and find out what this was about, what they were really referring to. Some people say that we ought to interpret this as more of an allegorical statement, not a literal statement. I know Mike Licona has pointed to that possibility, and actually that landed him in a lot of hot water for making that claim that this is even a potential option. But he points to the fact that there are these kinds of language when it comes to I think it's the coronation or the birth of different kings. There's this language in different traditions of people rising from their graves, and it's just this momentous event. I don't know what to think about that. I would also just leave open the possibility that maybe this really did happen, that there were some saints that God knew, hey, I got to have these guys around for the next phase of the church. And so he raised them from the dead. Jesus was already raising people from the dead. So it's not, he raised Lazarus from the dead. So it's not at all a stretch of the imagination to think that he could do that in his dying moments on the cross. And I think I would lean towards the idea that they didn't rise to heaven if they were risen from the dead. If they did rise from, if this is meant to be a literal passage of raising, then it's more of a temporary resuscitation. So just like Lazarus, he is raised from the dead, he's resuscitated, but then he lives the rest of his human life and presumably dies in a normal fashion. So that would be my understanding of that. Do you have any other thoughts on that, Alycia? Or
Yeah, no, thank you, Susan, for this question. And just one quick thing, in case people are looking it up, it's Matthew 27. So not
Mm,
Matthew 12. It just because it happens after his crucifixion.
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, but Matthew 27, and it's 52 through 50, 54-ish, whatever it might be, 53-ish. Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is, it talks about how they came out of the tombs, and after Jesus' resurrection, they went to the holy city and appeared to many people. Right. So you got these tombs breaking open, the bodies of many holy people who were dead, raised to life. They come out of the tombs, and then after the resurrection, they go into the holy city and appear to many people. Just one of the things to keep in mind with this passage is, like Matthew said, I mean, I'm not exactly sure what to do with it either, but one of the things that is interesting to me is, number one, it's only found in Matthew. Why is it only found in Matthew? That to me is an interesting thing, when something so monumental, if people had physically gotten up and started walking around, that would have been reported in, I would think, Luke and John at the very least. Mark would have found a way to put it in a sentence as good as he is at condensing things, and or written by somebody else. So I think that is interesting that it's only written about in Matthew, which is, I think, is one of the reasons why people land on different sides of it, because there just isn't enough information to say, yeah, this was definitely a literal thing versus it was a spiritual type of thing. Saying that the people who are spiritually dead are now going to be raised to life and this kind of thing as a result of his resurrection. But it says he appeared to many people, right? So you have these other things. So it's one of those things that, yeah, like it'd be a great thing to ask somebody someday. I don't think if you hold a it wasn't a literal thing, it was a spiritual thing, that makes you a heathen. I think it's a
Mm,
passage where we don't have a lot surrounding it, and it seems like a very extraordinary thing to just have it be written about in just one place. So yeah, Susan, so there's some things that you'll get people who land on both sides, and I'm really comfortable with saying I don't know about things. So that's kind of where I am.
yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's one of those that I don't think we need to have it all sorted out to believe that the resurrection actually happened and to believe that there's a really good case for the resurrection. So, Let me ask you, Alycia, one question that I've been seeing more and more on social media, and especially as we get into this TikTok generation where
Ah.
people like to throw around big claims about history, especially sensational claims. And it's very easy for these things to spread rapidly because people are not interested in reading a 400 page book on the resurrection as much as they are, reposting a quick gotcha headline from a TikToker on a claim. So I've been seeing a lot of TikToks on social media claiming that Easter itself is a pagan holiday. So what do you think about that?
I like your preface with TikTok and social media. You are absolutely right that people say a lot of things. I just had somebody else write to me about something they heard on TikTok. They said, "What do you think about it?" Because somebody was referencing there was some scientific study that came out that said X, Y, and Z, and like, well, we want to know what you think about it. I'm like, well, have you read the scientific study? No, but I'm sure it's on Google somewhere. Well, read the scientific study. See if number one, if it even exists, and then see what it actually says. Like just because somebody puts a video doesn't mean it's true. So, yeah, this idea, first of all, that Easter is a pagan holiday. Keep in mind what Easter is. Easter, a lot of Christians and churches will call this. It's Resurrection Day. It is literally a holiday celebrating the resurrection of Jesus Christ. That's what it's about for any Christian, right? So Jesus wasn't a pagan. So it's not like Christians are celebrating a pagan man. They're celebrating the man in which their name comes from, Christus. So they are Christians who come from Christ. And so that is literally what it means. But here's let me give you a little backdrop. So what people typically say is that it comes from this pagan god, Ostra or Syra or something like that. And she was the goddess of light. She was the goddess of fertility, the goddess of life. And she had this bird, and she turned this bird into a bunny or a rabbit. And this rabbit laid eggs, and that's where we get the Easter eggs and all this kind of thing. Okay. So they say, therefore, this is where Christians get this from. So here's the thing we need to keep in mind. Number one, believe it or not, contrary to what you see in the grocery stores and in the stores, Easter is not about Easter eggs and a bunny rabbit for Christians. It's as you see, the whole agenda or the whole topic of what we're talking about today is resurrection. That's what Easter is, and so it's referring to that. So number one, the bunnies and the eggs and all of that stuff have nothing to do with the original meaning. But here's the question I would ask somebody who says that is, what valid historical documentation tells us or indicates to us that Christians got this idea of Easter from this pagan goddess Ostra or Syra or whatever? Like what is the documentation that you have? So stepping back again, outside of the TikTok video or the YouTube clip, what is the actual document source that says, hey, this is this Easter bunny or these kind of things, and then all of a sudden Christians are now taking that.
Are
And I
you
think,
are you echoing the John Dixon claim? Are you going to eat a page of your Bible if somebody can bring one accredited historian who is willing to do this?
wow, way to put me on the spot, right? I'm like, I guess I probably should. I guess I'd have to make that same claim that if you show this, prove this, yeah, this document, this valid document, yeah, then we'd have to eat a whole page because
Oh
although I'd
boy,
hate to take it from the Bible because I'm kind of like, I don't want to lose a page in my Bible. So maybe you have to read
that's
another thing.
true.
But
That's
either
true.
way, yes.
Mm,
I mean, this matters, guys. What are your sources? Like you've got to
mm,
challenge your sources. And
mm.
Matthew and I are in a bit more privileged position because we are constantly trying to go back to original sources, valid sources that are accepted by a large majority of scholars. It's why you heard Matthew say earlier on, the empty tomb is one that may be slightly less assurance than the rest because there is a percentage of scholars that say that this might be questionable, right? Because we're always trying to give credibility to the sources and be honest about those sources and give validity where we need to. So yeah,
Yeah.
so I would say I don't think that there's any body to it. And 96 AD, so you're talking 60 or so years after Jesus' resurrection, you've got Clement of Rome saying, God has made the Lord Jesus Christ the first fruits by raising him from the dead. So from that, even that early on, you've got someone who wasn't an eyewitness, but was early on talking about, what Jesus did by raising him from the dead, let alone all the New Testament accounts and things like that. So Easter goes way beyond an Easter bunny or a TikTok video.
Yeah. And I think even if you could somehow show that this was originally a pagan holiday and Christians commandeered it or something like that, I don't think you could say that what we're doing in Easter is somehow sinful or it's somehow wrong. We're literally celebrating that Jesus died on the cross and that he rose from the grave. And so there's nothing pagan about that. There's nothing. I think of even in First Corinthians where Paul talks about this food sacrificed to idols, and he's like, an idol is not really anything. There's no God but one. And so he says make allowance for those who are weaker, who don't understand these things. But he's really trying to also just say, we ought not to fear these things, and live kind of this fearful mindset of, oh no, what if there's some pagan that did this thing before I did it? It's like, well, no, all things are made by God. This is a godly world that we live in. Unless something is directly sinful itself, we ought not live in fear of violating some hidden principle that we don't understand. So I think if you're curious on this question more, Michael Jones of Inspiring Philosophy, if you look up his YouTube channel, he's got a ton of videos debunking the idea that Easter is a pagan holiday. And he does a great job going into all of the primary historical data around it. He explains where we got the Easter bunny from, where we got Easter eggs from, all of these different things. So would definitely recommend checking that out. Alycia, I want to ask a question to you, because I know you've studied Islam a good bit, and so I would be curious to hear your take on what do you think about when Muslims claim that the Quran says that Jesus was not crucified, and nor did he die. And some of them will claim that it was Judas that took his place on the cross, and that Allah disguised his face to look like Jesus so that people would believe that it was Jesus. What would you say to that sort of claim
Yeah.
around the resurrection?
So this is such an interesting claim to me. Because as far as I can tell, Islam is the only major world religion that says Jesus didn't die on a cross. And you could talk to a guy like Christopher Hitchens, well-known atheist who has since passed away. You could talk to Richard Dawkins, probably the world's most famous atheist. You could talk to, these big atheists, and they'll acknowledge that he lived and died on a cross. Bart Ehrman. I mean, none of these guys are going to challenge that because it's so historically documented. And so it's one of those facts that's really not negotiable, because of the large amount of information we have about him, or about his crucifixion, even down to, like I told you, that people have even named that it was under Pontius Pilate that it happened. So it's an interesting one to me. Just so you understand, a big reason why they say that is because Jesus is very highly revered. Maybe you don't realize that, but Jesus is highly revered within the Islamic faith. They do believe that he's coming back at the end. And part of what ISIS was trying to do and all of this jihad that we saw was trying to bring in the end of times and because this idea that if they ushered in by establishing, conquering, Jesus would come back and therefore rule over this particular I guess nation or whatever it is. I'm blanking a little bit here, but that's what they were trying to do. They were essentially trying to usher in the return of Jesus. So the idea that he would die on a cross is so horrendous then, because God would never allow somebody so precious to die on a cross. And I think that there's a couple things worth noting there. First of all, this idea of somebody so precious, such a great prophet, dying on the cross being so abhorrent. I think there's actually some level of similarity with a Christian there. There is this recognition that this God, who is so perfect and is so good and who has not done anything wrong, chose to come and die on that cross. This is why Jesus says, I didn't come to be served, but to serve and give my life as a ransom for many. So this God that chose to come down here, who did not deserve the cross, who was precious, who was highly valued, took it anyways. And so I kind of, I get that. Yeah, this is mind blowing to us too, that God would choose that. because we're like, that he wasn't the one deserving. Even when he was on the cross, there was two people that were crucified with him. And, one of them's mocking, like, if you're the king, get us down, all these kind of things. You got all this power, get us down from the cross. And the other guy is like, look, you better calm all that down because we're guilty, but this guy's actually innocent. There was this recognition, even while he was hanging there, this guy was innocent. When he died, the Roman centurion looked at afterwards, got dark and the earth shook and curtain rips in two. And he's like, wow, this Roman guards was like, wow, he really must have been the Son of God when he saw what happened, and so this idea that it was that God would have somebody so precious and beautiful and pure and sinless die on the cross blows our mind too. And that's one of the reasons why Christians are so grateful. For the longest, I was like, somebody raised me once, why do you guys call Good Friday good? It's literally the day that Jesus was crucified. And I'm like, that is such a valid question. Why I had never caught that before.
Yeah.
Like that is so good. And then in realizing it, it's like, well, they call it good because not because it was good for Jesus, but because it was so good for us. Like what he chose to do was good for us. And so that's why we call it good, because it changed everything. But the second thing is, if Jesus didn't die and it really was Judas, and so it was made to look like it was Jesus, then essentially Allah set up a grand scheme to deceive everybody that saw, all of Jesus's followers that saw Jesus, even though it's not Jesus, it's Judas on the cross. So all of his followers see him. The Roman guards see him. All these other eyewitnesses are seeing him, and they are now going to give their lives. They are now going to write letters that are going to make up this New Testament. They are going to be spreading this message around the world, all due to a deception. What does it say about the character of God then, if he is going to use that level of deception and have it carry on through thousands of years? I don't think it even looks well on a lot for him to even be Judas, for it to be Judas up there. So I think the idea of forgiveness and grace within Christianity is just very foreign. They use the same words, but doesn't have the same meanings within Islam. And this idea that I could be forgiven what I've done and be made righteous because of Jesus before God is so foreign to a Muslim, because the only thing that can make them good is their good deeds. And so, and Christianity teaches us the opposite. So to them, the whole thing doesn't seem like it makes any sense, and there doesn't really seem to be a need for it. And this is some of the things that Christians take for granted, is we don't realize how much that this crucifixion changes how we see God, changes how we relate to God, we can be receivers of his forgiveness and mercy and grace, because the judgment was on him.
Yeah. So good, Alycia. And I think just looking just at the historical data between these two claims that Jesus, did die and he was crucified versus he didn't die and he wasn't crucified, you've got the eyewitnesses of Jesus who were there, who lived and talked with him, who talked with him after he rose from the dead, who ate meals with him, who touched his wounds. They're saying he died on the cross and that he rose from the dead. And then 600 years later, you've got a man, several hundred miles away, claims to be a prophet and claims, no, none of that actually happened. So from a historical standpoint, I think I want to go with the eyewitnesses who actually walked and talked with Jesus when it comes to that claim. So that's really great. Thank you for that. We've got a question here from The Last of His Kind. You got to put the upper intonation at the end of the sentence to let her know that it's a question. Like with the story of the adulterous woman, not in the earliest manuscripts we do have, couldn't there be more of these, but we just don't know about because we don't have the first gospel copies? So I'm not sure what you're referring to of couldn't there be more of these? But let me just say this: when it comes to the Gospels and what we have, yes, we don't have the original autographed manuscripts that the authors wrote. So I'd love to have that. I'd love to have, the original signature from John. This is his Gospel, or Mark, or whatever it is. But we don't have those. What we have are copies, and lots of copies. Okay. You said interpolations, things that were added in later. Now, so what we do have is we have a a remarkable consistency when we
Mm.
look at the manuscript data for the Bible. So there are like you point out, there are a couple passages like the woman caught in adultery, like the end of Mark. There's a couple famous passages where we say, some of the earliest manuscripts that we have don't have this story, or some of the best ones that we have don't have this story. Should it be there or not? And so you'll see if you read in your Bible, if it's a good Bible, it'll have a footnote in it that says, this story does not appear in the earliest manuscripts or the best manuscripts. So there's sort of an open question: should that be in there or not? The great thing is that's an extremely small amount of cases. In the vast majority of cases, we have near universal agreement for the rest of the Bible when it comes to these things. So um, we have a lot of confidence that the what we have in our Bibles today is what was originally written. Those couple of passages that are a little bit up in the air, we want to be as honest as we can and say, hey, we're still digging, we're still unearthing new copies, we're still finding, for example, the Dead Sea Scrolls was such a massive discovery because we found all of these scrolls, and we found that was mostly, I think, Old Testament scrolls, but it was a huge historical discovery. But we're always finding more and more manuscripts and fragments to compare to, and so we want to be a little bit humble with that. But I think when it comes to most of the passages in the Bible, we have extreme confidence because we don't just have one early copy. We've got, dozens of early copies of that passage. And look, it's the same, it's the same, it's the same, it's the same, it's the same. And that gives us confidence to know that the Bible that we have today is accurately reporting what was originally recorded back in the day.
That's great. Matthew, I have a question for you. I want to know your thoughts on
Sure.
something.
Yeah.
And I'm happy to share mine as well, but I want to hear from you first. This is, for those you don't know, this is one of Matthew's favorite things to talk about. It's really he gets excited about it. And so I want to know, Matthew, and I'll share mine afterwards, but is there something, what is your favorite thing about this whole resurrection topic? Is it an evidential thing? Is it something about the minimal facts? Is it the meaning? Like, what about this topic is it that excites you so much? Like, what is your favorite part of it all?
Yeah, it's a great question. I talked about, I think, one of the things already, which is that it's such a silver bullet one way or another, because we're talking about, really, this is the linchpin of Christianity. This is our central historical claim that Jesus
Mhm.
came to earth, that he died on the cross, and that he rose from the grave. And this is what Christianity is about. And so,
Mhm.
if we can show that it's not true, then Christianity isn't true. But if we can show that there's really good reasons to believe that it's true, then you have really good reason to believe that Christianity is true. Um, so I love that kind of element of it. I love kind of the investigative aspect to it. As I speak about it, I often speak from the perspective of Sherlock Holmes and the
Yeah.
case of the missing Messiah. And so I love Sherlock Holmes. I love this kind of
Mhm.
detective mindset of we're trying to piece together the details, and we've got this sort of forensic investigation that we're looking at the data, and we want to piece it together as best as we can and recollect what actually happened. And I think it's an exciting way of thinking
Mm.
about that. It's there's been a lot of books that have been written about it. Of course, The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, who was an investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune. We've got J. Warner Wallace's Cold Case Christianity, who he's a cold case detective. You've got a lot of just these themes around the investigation itself. And so if you've never read those books before, I would just highly recommend that you read them, because they don't read like a textbook of doctrines or theology. It reads more like an investigative novel, The Case for
Mm.
Christ or Cold Case
Mhm.
Christianity. I think you'll find them to be very engaging, no matter who we are.
That's good. That's good. I like
Yeah.
that. Um, The Case for Faith was like the big book that I was already thinking like an apologist, but I didn't know it was a field until The Case for Faith was the
Mm,
big life-changing book for me when I picked it off the shelf in college and was like, "What? People are doing what I what I do or what I'm thinking or the
Yeah.
questions I ask. So Alycia was great. So I like what Anna says. Do you want to read what Anna says?
Write that book. Great title, Sherlock Holmes in the Case of the Missing Messiah. Maybe we'll see. We'll see. It might have to happen at some point.
Yeah.
So
Yep. It's so
it's in the
good.
back of my mind. Thanks.
Well, I feel less holy than you, Matthew, when I give my favorite part of the resurrection.
Wow, holy! I just talked about Sherlock Holmes. What's the holdup? What's your favorite part?
So, when I was in high school, my high school English teacher was Catholic, and so she had mentioned to me, she knows Christian. She mentioned to me that in 1984, I believe 1986, the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA, wrote an article on the crucifixion of Jesus, and they analyzed it as medical professionals. It had never really been done before from the medical community. And so they looked at where would the nails have to go in his hands and in his feet, and what would have caused him to die in terms of, breathing and asphyxiation, just whatever it might be. They went through all that. What would the loss of blood have done, and the flogging, and it's just really, really interesting. You could find it online. I'm sure it's easy. They got in a lot of trouble because people were mad that a medical journal would attack a religious type thing. I mean, I just thought it was a cool thing to do.
Yeah.
But one of the things that they talked about in there that I found really helpful, and Dr. G, Medical Examiner, I used to watch a lot of Dr. G, Medical Examiner. You can learn a lot from an autopsy. And I learned so much medical stuff from her when I used to watch the show years ago. And so I don't know which one I learned it from first, probably JAMA, but maybe it was reinforced with Dr. G. But either way, surrounding your heart is something called a pericardial sac. And it's a fluid-filled sac. Clear liquid, I think, clearish or light color liquid, we'll say, of surrounding the heart. And when this sac bursts, your heart will no longer function properly, so you're dead. And when JAMA, the Journal of American Medical Association, was going through what happened at the crucifixion, they talked about the spear that pierced into Jesus' side, and it talks about how outflowed blood and water. And in that era, they would not have really understood any of these kind of things. But when JAMA was going through it, they talked about, they believed that was the piercing of the pericardial sac. So that fluid comes out, which looks like water, and then also, the blood as well. And I just thought that was such a really cool thing, something that that those early, Roman centurions, Roman guards would not have known what was happening, or even the early writers that were writing this stuff would not have known was happening. But yeah, to have that kind of explained medically, I thought was really cool. So that's one of my, I feel very morbid. But
no, that's awesome. I mean, you're getting into
things.
some of the scientific evidence that points towards the validity of these claims, and sort of an undesigned coincidence there that this description, which they wouldn't have known exactly what was happening there, but now we can later medically retrace the steps and say, actually, this makes sense.
Exactly.
And even building off of that, the case in the Garden of Gethsemane right before the crucifixion, Jesus is praying, and it's described that he sweats drops of blood.
Yes, they talk about that
and
too.
That's a real medical phenomenon.
It
right?
is,
which is wild.
You're absolutely right. And I read that in that same article. I was like, what? I forget what it's called. Hema something, but you're right. It is under extreme duress and stress. I don't know if it's at the little veins or capillaries ever burst. And so out it comes out but I don't remember what it was, but they talked about that this is what they think was happening. And so you're right. Like that's in there too. And also the pericardial sac being pierced helps deal with one of the issues called the swoon theory, this idea that maybe Jesus didn't really die, but he just passed out, right? But keep in mind, he had gone through a brutal flogging before. Some people didn't even make it to the cross because they died in the flogging. He was so weak, he couldn't even carry his cross. Somebody else had to carry it for him up to him being crucified. And then he died really quickly, comparative. They came to break his legs and he was already dead. Even Pilate was surprised that he had died already because they wanted to get him down before Passover and all these things. So he died within like 6 hours. Or in about 6 hours. So, I mean, clearly there was a lot going on. So how could somebody in that level of condition with that level of blood loss and pain have been put in a tomb? And like you said, the Roman guards would have gotten in trouble if he had not died. put in a tomb, and be able to get up and walk around fully functional after 2 days. I mean, at the very least, he would have still been like just lying there, like, but to get up and be so functional, walk around, here I am, and it's just like, So, but the pericardial sac kind of, I feel like, is the proverbial nail in the coffin, I feel like, because once you pierce that sac, that's it for the heart. And so it kind of really also defeats the swoon theory. Yeah.
Yeah. Proverbial and literal nail in the coffin. So that's awesome.
That's true. Yeah.
Well, we're wrapping up our time here, guys. If you have any last questions to put in the chat, now is the time for us to talk about with the resurrection here. Again, we just want to point out that we've got some great articles on this that have been written by Derek Caldwell that we are publishing one a day on our website, which is apologetics.org. I've got a couple on there. One talking about why is it important for it to be a literal bodily resurrection? We've already talked about that. Just briefly, I want to address. I think there might be some of you in the chat who are listening to this and just going, it's really nice that religious people can believe this and that it makes you feel good, but just dead bodies stay dead, and this just seems like an impossible kind of thing. And just to address that, this is one of the articles that I wrote on this subject, which is that's sort of echoing this mindset of David Hume, who was a secular philosopher and a very influential philosopher, British philosopher, who wrote about miracles. And he made this huge claim that he was going to disprove miracles for all time, for all civilized people. And his claim was essentially this: miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and as firm and unalterable experience of all mankind is that the laws of nature cannot be broken. Therefore, miracles are impossible. So this is his argument. Essentially, miracles would be a violation of the laws of nature, but we've never observed the laws of nature being broken. Therefore, a miracle is impossible. The problem with that is it's circular reasoning. You're putting your conclusion in your second premise when you say no one has ever observed a miracle. We've observed that the laws of nature cannot be broken. And so it's sort of this defining miracles out of existence. But if there is a God who has created the universe, he's created these regularities, these regular ways that things are observed, why can't he intervene? Why can't he step in and change things and change the way that things are? Especially if this is God himself, if this is God in the flesh, of course he can do that kind of a thing. So there's no logical contradiction here. And I think this is important to say too, that sometimes we have this perspective of ancient people that they were just gullible and they would just believe anything.
Yep,
and,
I'm just thinking that.
We are the scientific minded. Right. And it's like, no, they were shocked about it as well. They weren't going like, oh yeah, another Tuesday, another resurrection. Like, no, they were going, no, this has never happened before in the history of humanity. And so they were well aware that this was something that was miraculous. They just didn't say that it was impossible, because with God, all things are possible.
That's a great point. That's exactly what I was thinking. I mean, they'd seen Jesus raise, Lazarus from the dead, and there were stories in the Old Testament people rising from the dead. But for somebody to raise himself is different.
Yeah.
And also for him to make all the claims that he did throughout his life and then to raise himself is very unique. So he said he would do it. There's also passages which say God raised him from the dead. So Jesus says he raised himself and God says he raised himself. Only makes sense if Jesus is God. So just a little message out there to just kind of indicating that even through the resurrection, we see the divinity of Jesus exemplified. So
that's great. We've got a great question here, which is, other than Joseph of Arimathea, what other evidence that Jesus' body was put in a tomb and not tossed into a mass grave of crucified criminals, and also any early empty tomb evidence too? So just on this idea of how do we know Jesus was buried? We've got multiple independent sources that report it. So that's already a really strong reason right there. It's consistent with Jewish laws, which were respected by the Romans at that time. The Romans wanted to keep peace with the Jewish nation. They didn't want another rise of the Maccabees like they had in the past. They knew that the Jewish people were very fiercely independent and committed to their religion. And so in order to keep the peace, they allowed the Jewish people to continue to practice their religion and to have sort of this protected status. And the Jewish law was that people would be buried, and so the Romans would respect this. The cover story of the idea that the disciples stole the body, which is what is reported in the Gospels, that shows that that there was a known tomb. Because in order for us to say, hey, the disciples stole the body, they go, where did they steal the body from? Right? You have to have a place for them to steal the body from if they're going to steal the body. Now that's a very bad explanation, because the disciples had no motive, means, or opportunity for why they would steal the body of Jesus. But it's a cover story that admits that there was a tomb and that the tomb was empty. So that's a powerful reason there. There is, again, the Joseph of Arimathea is a member of the Jewish Council, which I didn't really go into this, but the criterion of embarrassment is something that historians look at when they look at historical claims. And they say, the more embarrassing a claim is, the more likely it is to be true, in the sense that if you're trying to create an idealized story of something, you include all the best elements. You make it look, as good as you can. You don't say that it was women who discovered the empty tomb, because that would be embarrassing, because women weren't viewed as reliable eyewitnesses at that time. And you don't say that Jesus was buried in the tomb of a member of the Jewish council. You say, he was buried in Lazarus's tomb, this tomb that he rose Lazarus out of. Some sort of follower of Jesus, if you're just trying to create a believable account. But if you're actually reporting history, then you report what actually happened, no matter how embarrassing it is. So that's a very, very important one right there. And then you've just got the fact that Christianity was first proclaimed in Jerusalem, which is the very city where Jesus was crucified. And so this is a very easy place, if he was thrown into some mass grave, or if he was buried in some tomb and the tomb was still full, then it would be easy to go to that and say, hey, look, here's the body, here's the place where we threw him into. And yet again, that's not what the enemies of Jesus say. They say, no, the disciples stole the body. We have to come up with some sort of cover story to figure out how to explain this. So yeah, I think we've got some really good reasons to both believe in that the tomb was full and then it was empty.
Yeah, and I think one of Derek's article, either part 2 or part 3, gets into that. So you can also read more of that, although Matthew really outlined it really well, but you can read more of that, the last of its kind. Part 2 or part 3, I think, is where it's found on our website of the Resurrection series.
That's great. Anna also added, and the disciples stuck to their story through beatings and persecution, even to their deaths, which is really good, because, people aren't willing to die for something that they know is a lie. Liars make very poor martyrs.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't have, I've heard some people make too big of a claim on this. They say, we know that all the disciples died for their faith. Well, we don't really know that. From a historical perspective, we don't have great evidence for all of the disciples. Sean McDowell did his PhD thesis on, or his dissertation on, the fate of the apostles, but he gives evidence for 4 of the apostles that we have really strong evidence that they were martyred for their faith, and we have no counter evidence that they would give up their faith. My pastor actually a couple weeks ago made the really strong point that in the example of Polycarp or other early martyrs, they were given the chance to recant 3 times. And it was, even on the 3rd try, if they would recant, if they would give up their faith, they would be put to death for it. So that this opportunity is open for you, right? Like if you're about to be crucified, you're about to die in one of the most horrific ways possible, and you know that this thing is a lie. Number one, it's not gotten you anything in this life. You've not become powerful or rich or famous or anything for it. You've just been beaten several times for it. So why would you believe it in the first place, or why would you claim it in the first place? But then at this point where you're going to be put to death, it's about to all be over, and you're about to die, why would you not recant? And if they did recant, I think we would have some sort of record of it to show that. So we've got really good reasons to believe that disciples really believed that
Hmm.
Jesus rose from the dead, and that
Hmm.
should give us confidence. So, anything else to add to that before we wrap up here, Alycia?
I don't think so. These are very, very good questions, guys, that you sent in. I really appreciated the variety of them. Um, and yeah, just I thought they were really good. So thanks for engaging so much, and definitely join us on some of our future ones. I think this was, um, I don't know. I think I really enjoyed myself tonight with you all. So thank you.
Yeah, this was great, guys. If you want to join us for the next stream, we do these once a month. So if you want to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, if you're watching on there, if you're on Facebook, follow our page there. If you're on Twitter, retweet, do all the social media things all at once. Why don't you go to all of them? You just go to all of them and follow all of them and retweet and like and repost and subscribe and hit the bell for all of them. And that way you could just stay maximally informed about all the things that we're doing. Like my YouTube channel, I got a YouTube channel too, Matthew Mittelberg. You can like and subscribe there. Would love to see you there. And other than that, thank you again for your questions and your discussion, guys. God
Yeah.
bless.